So my name's Sam Ansell. I work with the Coppice Coop, who've got a stall just over there, and we do coppicing and various crafts and activities. So today it's going to be quite a general chat about coppicing. Obviously it's a big subject, so it's going to be kind of quite overview. I'm not going to go into too much detail about any specific thing, I hope, unless I get sort of sidetracked. But the main theme of the talk is to talk about coppicing and see what emerges about these two themes of ecology and resource production, and see what comes out in terms of the kind of relationship between those two. Maybe you guys already know quite a bit about coppicing, but I'll just kind of give a basic intro anyway. So coppicing comes from the French couper, to cut. So it's all about cutting, but the cutting the trees is the easy bit. Making them grow back as healthy and productive and useful trees is the complicated bit, which is probably familiar to most foresters. It's a very broad management approach. And one of the key features is the different age at which it's harvested, which in forestry we call the rotation. So you can go from basket willow, which is harvested on a 1-year rotation, right up to oak coppice, which can be harvested every 25 to 35 years, and many stages in between that. With these two themes of kind of resources and ecology, I'll start with a bit of a discussion of coppicing from a kind of management sense and a resource sense. We're talking about cutting trees. More specifically, we're talking about cutting them down at ground level to encourage multi-stemmed regrowth. So your classic tree has got not one nice big trunk. A coppice tree will have many shoots coming out of an established root system. One of the key words there is vigorous. So the reason that coppicing regrowth is so incredibly vigorous is that the plant in question, let's say for example it's a hazel stool, is a very well established plant. It might be 100 years old, it might be 200 years old, it might be 300 years old. So that plant is being cut regularly, and it has a massive root system which has a reserve of energy within the roots. It also has a vast capacity to access water and nutrients from the soil, but it has very little above ground growth to look after. So it can go for it. In the first year of coppice regrowth, we're talking usually 6 foot of growth, and from a typical hazel stool, you're looking at 30 to 50 rods on each stool. So incredibly good way of growing wood quickly, and getting a lot of biomass or resources. So everyone know what a hazel stool is? A stool is a single plant. I'm just saying that so I can get my favourite coppice joke in, which is what's brown and sticky? A stool. That's my best coppice joke. There's not any better coppice jokes than that for today.
How many coppice jokes are there?
Well, the other ones are like a lot worse than that. So let's just say one. There's some key management considerations when growing good coppice. As I mentioned before, the difficult bit is getting it to grow back well. Those key management considerations are also probably familiar to a lot of foresters, and that's good light conditions, good stocking density, so all the stalls are packed in close and they're growing upwards towards the available light rather than growing outwards with lots of side branches, and protection from browsing, which is familiar themes to most people establishing woodland. So that's a quick sort of whistle stop over the kind of management and some of the resource aspects of it. Just to go for a little summary of the ecological aspects of coppicing, some of the ecological aspects. I'm not an ecologist, so this is a very, very much an overview. So we've got a coppice cycle. When we cut coppice, it regrows and then it gets cut again when it's ready to be harvested. That process, the stages of those cycle, have different kind of ecological conditions going on at each time. So in the first and second years of a coppice being cut, we've got the key feature is maximum light to a woodland floor that previously has been shaded. What that means is that a lot of the wildflowers and plants that are lying dormant in the seed bank have a sudden opportunity to thrive. And there is very little other competition. So there's no grass, there's nothing else, there's no bracken, there's nothing vigorous that could outcompete them. So they've got their kind of full opportunity to absolutely go for it. What that obviously means is that you've got an abundance of flowers and plants which provide food sources and habitats for a wide range of other species, insects, butterflies, not just food sources but places to lay eggs. And then from those flowers and plants and seeds and berries, you've then got food source for these insects, which then can also provide food source for birds, small mammals, on up the food chain. So very valuable in that sense. Valuable in a broad sense of kind of introducing lots of new habitat to woodland, but also very valuable in quite a specific sense. Some butterflies in particular will only lay their eggs in very specific places. So the Duke of Burgundy butterfly only lays its eggs on primroses, and apparently it only really lays them on south-facing leaves of primroses in full sun. Fussy, right? And then the caterpillar can then uses that as a food source as well. And you know, those habitats are, you know, very common in coppicing, but not so common in other forms of woodland management. So can be specifically very critical as well. So after our kind of initial couple of years of full light, flooded light conditions, vigorous kind of flora growth, we've then got from year 2 to 5 a really thickety stage of coppice regrowth. So the trees are a bit bigger, but they're not fully shading yet. So we've got lots of structure, we've got loads of brambles, honeysuckle, bracken, grass, really dense, sometimes impossible to walk through. That is great structurally, and it's also great in a food sense as well. So the dense tangly habitat, loads of berries and nuts and seeds, and also loads of places for nesting birds, and lots of habitat for things, particularly dormice. So there's been a dormice reintroduction programme in some coppices that we work in Gate Barrows Nature Reserve, and they absolutely depend on that kind of dense, thickety stage. That's their sort of favourite place to be. Years 5 to 8, we're then talking a gradual process of canopy closure. So the trees have grown up above that tangled scrub layer. They've filled in the gaps of light. We've got shading that suppresses the bracken, the brambles, all of these really vigorous plants that otherwise would kind of dominate. They die back, and we're kind of going back to where we started, really. We've got a kind of relatively open woodland floor, not much competition from the vigorous stuff, canopy closure, back to the beginning. So we've got this kind of cycle which can then be repeated. And very conveniently, after this kind of 7 to 8 years where we've got canopy closure, we also have hazel or other small coppice wood grown to just about the perfect size for a wide variety of traditional crafts and uses. So those two things fit really nicely. So as I'm sure you've got the picture, we're talking about a really amazing structural diversity. We've also got what we call, so that's structural diversity. We've got like vertical structural diversity, so different layers within the woodland. We've also got lateral structural diversity, by which I mean in our ideal coppice woodland where there's 8 coops. Coop is an area that you would cut in each year. Each year that's being cut, one's being cut, which means that we've got a mosaic of shifting habitats and structures within the woodland at all times. And so species that can move to exploit their preferred areas as they go, so they're kind of cycling around the woodland. And we've also got lots of edge habitat, which as anyone who knows a bit about ecology, is really valuable. So great for ecology. So back to the next thing I'd like to do is just give a kind of a bit of a historical overview of coppicing in the UK, leading up to kind of what's been happening over the past century to kind of where we're at now. Starting quite far back, so in Somerset we've got the Sweet Track, which is a track that was laid over some marshy ground. It was constructed in 3800 BC, and it's made mostly out of coppice wood. So people have been on this tip for a long time. We then have a gradual increase in the intensification of woodland management in the UK during the medieval era and the kind of early modern era, where populations were growing, economies were becoming more complex, and there was a huge demand on the woodland resource, to the point that nearly every scrap of woodland in the UK was being fairly intensively managed, and most of that was being managed as coppice, or coppice with standards. I won't go into that now just for the sake of time, but there is a way to manage kind of coppice for your underwood and also manage to get larger trees out of the same woodland for your barns or your shipbuilding, all that kind of stuff. So massive pressure on the woodland resource for a long, long time. And that's one of the reasons that coppicing evolved as it did, is because it's just an incredibly effective way to get a large amount of useful material out of an incredibly small amount of space. And it's also sustainable. And when I say it's sustainable, I mean in the old sense of sustainable rather than the modern sense of sustainable, as in it's possible to harvest resources continuously over time with no diminishment in the availability or quality of that resource. It's ecologically and socially sustainable in other ways, but in terms of the history, these coppices were being managed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, continuously, still providing what they needed to provide. So, in the lakes, coppicing had a particularly strong role in the early Industrial Revolution. I talked about this a little bit yesterday in my charcoal course, but when the Industrial Revolution started, there was a massive demand on coppice products to fuel the factories and the mills. There was loads of bobbin mills around here that were providing bobbins for all the Lancashire cotton mills. There were gunpowder works, there was charcoal needed for iron foundries. So again, huge pressure on the woodland resource, but an ability to manage it sustainably in order to kind of meet that demand. We then had the change started really, I would say, when and in some ways the pressure eased off of the coppice resource when we started to enter the fossil fuel era. So when coal became available, that led to many changes. Coal could replace charcoal for a lot of things, and it also meant that there was kind of the possibility to develop different transport and infrastructure around it. So we're talking about global transportation becoming easier, so it's easier to import wood, and we're also talking about the British Empire being able to have access, being able to extract resources from the rest of the world and bring them here. So that reduced the pressure on the UK kind of coppicing and woodland situation. So we were kind of already in a bit of a gradual decline in coppicing as we went into the 20th century, but then the real game changer was World War I and World War II. Changed society in many ways, but changed coppicing hugely, kind of put an end to coppicing in the UK really. And the reason for that was partly due to the kind of advance in petrochemicals and oil. So a lot of products that used to be made out of wood could be made out of plastics. And also transportation, mechanisation, changes in labour structure. Nobody was out in the woods coppicing after that, or very few. To the point at which there was hardly anybody cutting coppice in the Lake District in the 60s and 70s. Maybe one person called Bill Hogarth, after whom there's an apprenticeship being set up, who was our kind of last living link between the more traditional kind of continuous tradition of coppicing up to the modern approach of coppicing. So the total decline of the industry led to the realisation that there was a massive decline in ecology. And we have to thank the ecologists for realising that there was a lot of species that used to be common in the woodlands which were in massive, massive decline. They managed to work out that actually the ecology around that was due to coppicing. And so there was a strong push to start coppicing again. So we had conservation bodies and ecologists starting to coppice, and they were coppicing for the purposes of conservation. That was great. That was getting a lot of important habitat back restored, but having that narrow focus on conservation meant that there was some issues with that. Some of those issues were that the conservation coppice actually ended up being quite different in some ways, in important ways ecologically, to the managed coppice, and it also meant that the wood that was arising from this conservation coppicing was seen as a byproduct or indeed a waste product, and there was a lot of effort going into just burning it all. So in the 80s and 90s, people were cutting coppice and just torching it. I don't want to denigrate the work of the conservation organisations. They were doing as best as they could, but they didn't have that kind of depth of management perspective on it to kind of figure that out at the time. The other issue with that approach is that it worked fine when there was a lot of money sloshing about in conservation pots, but after the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of conservation bodies found themselves totally strapped for cash, and then suddenly doing all this no-value coppicing, which cost loads of money to pay contractors, became less enticing. So we noticed a big reduction in the amount of sort of financial support that was available for conservation coppicing. So nowadays, most conservation bodies are looking to see how they can generate some income off of their reserves, or at least offset some of the costs of the work that they do, which is great. And modern coppicers are trying to generate income from coppice materials. So we can reach a really kind of win-win situation where if the reserve managers or the woodland owners are getting the key management factors right, then they're growing sufficiently high quality for coppice workers such as ourselves to come in, harvest the material at no cost to them, so they're getting conservation benefits and woodland management benefits at zero cost, and we're getting a resource which we can then add value to and sustain our kind of ambition, which is to support local sustainable livelihoods. So that's a really nice win-win situation. And we also feel that there's a kind of a deeper economic sustainability to that practice, because it's not dependent on the sort of varying funding streams coming in, cash going away. If we can underpin what we do with actual resource and income generation, then it means we can carry on doing it despite what happens kind of, on the funding scene or on the policy scene. So yeah, this kind of story that we've been talking about, or that I've been talking about, we've seen this kind of move from coppicing back in the day being just a purely resource-focused activity with a completely accidental byproduct of amazing ecology. I don't think many people back in the day were thinking, oh, let's make sure we coppice this so that the butterflies have a nice time. They were just coppicing it to get what they needed. But we had this kind of, I'm sure some people were noticing it and appreciating it as well. But so yeah, we've had that kind of situation where the ecology was an accidental byproduct. We then had this mega swing in the kind of 70s, 80s and 90s where it suddenly became conservation coppicing was the thing, and ecology, resources were an accidental byproduct or a waste product. Now, our opinion in the Coppice Co-op is we like to present the ecology and the resources as co-products of coppicing. So neither necessarily has a greater or lesser role. They're both really critical. And one of the things that really excites me and I find really rewarding is that in many land management situations where you have to weigh ecological benefits with resource production, it ends up a bit of a more of one, less of the other kind of tension. It's like, great, right, we might be able to get a lot of ecological benefits out of this land, but that might mean a massive reduction in the resource output. And we just don't experience that tension at all in coppicing. The two things work really well together. You can get amazing resources, you can get amazing ecology, and it's incredibly rare that there's any kind of compromise between those two. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer as best I can.
I've missed a great deal, so apologies. Just touching on your last point there, is that because the market is so good for Coppice products?
So the question there is, are we able to kind of maintain the resource output because the markets are good for Coppice products? The answer to that is very variable. The markets have completely changed to the traditional markets. The kind of things that people were producing 100 years ago. We're producing similar things, but we're not selling them to farmers or bobbin mills anymore. We're selling them to domestic, markets really. So part of the challenge of Coppice work is to find and develop and maintain new markets for traditional products, which can often be the hardest part. But it is doable. It involves quite a lot of work and quite a lot of thinking, but there are good markets out there, and it also comes down a little bit to, if you're a Coppice worker, how much time and effort you can put into your marketing and how good you are at it, because that's a whole skill set that's totally different to managing woodland well. So yeah, it's not easy. The markets are not easy. Our personal experience from the Coppice Co-op is that we do have good markets, but we've been going in one form or another in this area for 20 years, so we have a lot of good connections. But there are new people entering the Coppice profession all the time, and making careers and businesses out of it.
So are you reliant on conservation payments that you mentioned?
No, we're not relying on conservation payments. We do some contracting work, but that's not always Coppice related. Sometimes we'll do like scrub maintenance or kind of manage. We do get paid for some of our conservation work, but we also generate lots of income from Coppice that we don't get paid for. But key to our business model is having a range of different activities, so that if, for example, this year we had a very bad year for hurdles, demand seemed to drop after 10 years of increased demand, but we made a lot of charcoal, so we try and spread ourselves. Yeah.
What time of year are you cutting the Coppice, and does it change depending on the tree species?
So the question there is, what kind of year do we cut Coppice, and do we change it depending on tree species? We cut Coppice from November until end of February usually, so right in the dormant period. And no, it doesn't change on tree species. We just partly we cut at that time of year because we realise that cutting outside of that time of year has more of a negative ecological impact, and partly we're told to by the people that we work for. The season has shrunk. We used to be able to cut until the end of March, but quite possibly because of climate change, spring seems to be getting earlier and earlier, so in order to kind of limit our impact, we've moved that cutting date a bit forwards. We do sometimes cut a little bit in September or October. That doesn't seem to have as much impact as in spring. But it's also just a lot easier to work in the woods when there's no leaves about, and it's more pleasant when it's cold as well.
You talked, rightly so, you made the point that you don't want coppicing to have to rely on subsidies, for want of a better word, to be able to survive. But then on the other hand, there's also, it's not always easy necessarily getting a marketable product and enough to sustain the work.
Sure.
If state funding did have a role in coppicing, do you have any idea what you would want to see from that?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, just to reinstate the question. So the question is, if state funding did have a role in supporting coppicing, how would we like that to work? Yeah, I mean, I think the reason I was saying we're trying to develop a model that isn't based on subsidy is because there's so much change, and you can establish a business based on one particular income stream, and then when that changes, it can be a real struggle. But if people were supporting us financially to cut more coppice and do more, then we would be really happy to do that. One of the really key barriers is fencing. If there was some payment to cover the costs, the material and time costs of fencing coppice, that would have a massive impact on how easy it would be for us to restore and continue managing coppice. Because the margins are so slim, and because it depends so much on how well the coppice has been managed, if we're introduced to a bit of coppice that maybe has got some good bits or some bad bits and is just on the border, by the time we've added 5 person days of fencing plus potentially the materials costs, then we're onto a losing streak there.
And are you talking fencing for like individual coops? Like
Yes, yeah. I'm talking 6 foot temporary deer fencing, or permanent fencing possibly, but our model is that we tend to do temporary. Yeah.
Cool. I think we need to wrap up.
Cool.
So maybe it's a good time to say thank you to Sam. Got a bit of chat to us. And Sam is only over there, so if you've got questions.
Yeah, do come and say hi.
I'm going to let the chainsaw wielders do their thing.
Cool.